I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. As usual, we have a jam-packed show for you today, covering a variety of topics. We're going to start with Josh, who's doing a little postmortem. It is sort of a postmortem, but a postmortem on the speakership fight that happened. We're glad to have Josh back here and congratulate him on his wonderful news, his engagement. Congratulations, Josh. We're so glad to have you back.
Thank you, Emily.
Of course, you were in Israel, you were traveling, so I'm sure we'll have a little snippet at least of your time abroad. Then we're going to move over to Inez, who is going to talk to us about South Dakota and Big Trans. The title I'm supposed to be reading here is How Big Trans Conquered South Dakota, but Big Trans sounds like the name of a drag queen, so I had to get a little bit more specific. Then we're going to move over to Ben, who's going to talk to us about the weaponization of the federal government committee to look into intelligence abuses of power, and we're all sort of eagerly awaiting to see how that unfolds. And I'm going to talk about President Biden's trip to the border, his trip to Mexico, his trip to El Paso. So let me start by kicking it over to the newly engaged Josh Hammer.
Well, it is great to be back, Emily. Thank you so much for the kind words. I guess a couple of very quick housekeeping notes right off the bat, because I did miss like 2 to 3 episodes here. So I was away for 2.5 weeks or so, not just in Israel, but also in the UAE and Egypt, did like a little Middle East swings. Maybe I'll come back to that towards the end with some substantive commentary based on like the geopolitics and all of that. But I am engaged, so thank you again for that. I also, on a totally unrelated housekeeping note, I missed Rachel Bovart's sign off. My dear friend, our dear friend Rachel Bovart. So this podcast is not going to be the same without you, Rachel. But onwards and upwards, and maybe somewhere down the line we will rekindle the NatCon Squad OG relationship. I guess we shall see. But let's turn to the actual topic of the day. So I was kind of abroad, speaking of my trip, when this whole speaker fight really started picking up steam. I think when I landed like 2 Wednesday nights ago, by the time this podcast is released, we were like 5 or 6 ballots in or so. But my column, nonetheless, last week, I had seen more than enough that I felt equipped to comment on the various fights and where the lines were drawn and some key takeaways and lessons and all of that. So, this is our first episode since the fight finished. So I guess if you've been sleeping under a rock, the way this unfolded is that Kevin McCarthy ended up winning on a very dramatic 15th ballot. So I think it was 13 or 14 of the 20 holdouts basically ended up switching to McCarthy after securing various very meaningful concessions that we can get into in the discussion here. After I think it was the 12th or 13th ballot is when that Chip Roy-led crew switched to Kevin McCarthy. And ultimately, the way this finally went down, that the final holdouts, Andy Biggs, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, and so forth, just voted present. So they wouldn't affirmatively vote for McCarthy. They were just kind of lowering the denominator. So he basically snuck by. But he did manage to sneak by giving away the farm. I mean, I would argue that Kevin McCarthy, in the process of this, basically humiliated himself, if not the entire position of the Speaker of the House. Now, from a conservative perspective, that's a good thing, because I don't particularly trust Kevin McCarthy. I have never trusted Kevin McCarthy. He has always been kind of just about Kevin McCarthy, just about his own power, his own kind of quid pro quos, horse trading, his own kind of K Street lobbying and his connections and all of that. So from a conservative perspective, the fact that there's a restoration now of a single member motion to vacate the chair. Another very meaningful concession, I think, is the fact that we have, a contractual agreement now where the actual enforcement mechanism is the single member motion to vacate. But we have now a contractual agreement where there will be 12 distinct appropriations packages to actually fund the government. So no more kind of $1.7 trillion lame duck Congress omnibus surprises. I guess theoretically it could happen, but that would violate the agreement. And again, there is this, easily enforceable mechanism that I feel pretty confident at least Chip Roy, if no one else, would be very quick to utilize that enforcement mechanism. House Freedom Caucus members were able to attain, I think, 3 of the 9 seats on the very influential Rules Committee. So various other concessions as well. And you guys can kind of comment on that if you want to. Just in my final remaining minutes here before I throw it open, I want to talk about the losers, because the winners, I think, are conservatives here. But there are various losers from this fight as well. First and foremost is Kevin McCarthy, who, again, I think yet again showed what any astute political observer would know, which is that he's all about himself and that he doesn't particularly care about anything other than just sheer vocational advancement up the ladder. He proved that by weakening the position of the power, or weakening the power of the speakership as much as he did. I think also egg on the face, frankly, of President Donald Trump. I've seen some folks in kind of Trump world inner circle trying to spin this as a big win for Trump because at the very end, Marjorie Taylor Greene got him on the phone. I think that's frankly just Monday morning quarterbacking, a bit of nonsense, to be just very candid here. President Trump endorsed McCarthy before any of these balloting started, and then he doubled down on that vociferously after the third ballot. It wasn't until the 15th ballot when Kevin McCarthy won. And between ballots 3 and 15, you saw some of the Trumpiest members of the entire House Republican caucus, folks like Matt Gaetz, who literally went on TV and said, well, you know what, if President Trump messed up in any way, it was on personnel, so he's maybe not the best person to trust here. Lauren Boebert went so far as to tell Trump to instruct McCarthy to withdraw. So I don't think Trump comes out of this looking any more powerful than he did beforehand, to put it mildly. Final thing is, I think my column was partially about this, and Drew White had a fantastic column on this for Newsweek that we published earlier this week. I think a lot of establishment-friendly conservative commentators quite candidly came away from this looking not particularly good. And, I think we all know who we're talking about here. Happy to kind of get into the name blames if we really want to, but I'm going to avoid that for the time being there. But, I guess on that note, I'll throw it open to you guys. Do you guys agree with my kind of top line takeaways, or do you see it a little differently?
One thing I'll say is I think it was, I definitely agree with the top line takeaway. And I think, though, it still wasn't this like perfect, clear cut litmus test at the beginning, though, as the week wore on. And it was clear that people like Chip Roy had read the chips, no pun intended, but like they had figured out what they could bargain with better than most people on the outside. I think they knew they had McCarthy backed into a corner because there were no other viable options that could be consensus points. So you can't bring in Steve Scalise. You sure as hell can't bring in Fred Upton. And there's just Jim Jordan is not going to happen because then you lose the other folks. So they knew McCarthy needed them more than they needed him. And that was just more obvious, I think, to people who were negotiating behind closed doors than it was on the outside. While I think the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Jim Jordans and Ken Bucks of the world had very good reasons for sticking with McCarthy. And I think, there's some other folks that were, as I wrote in my piece, goofballs on the other side of it, pushing and pushing and pushing. I think this was a real winner for Chip Roy. Chip Roy and other folks emerged from that week looking like they are serious negotiators. They understand their power and they want to wield it wisely against the ballooning federal government. It's like sort of the last bastion or the last stand almost. And I think they understand the sort of timeliness, the desperation that the country is in. And so a big win. I think it was a huge win because when do you ever get the House to agree to doing single subject bills, 72-hour reading periods? These are like populist measures, like Tea Party fever dream stuff that actually happened in the House of Representatives. Maybe it'll go away in 2 years. Maybe the one-person motion to vacate will be an abject disaster. But it's a great experiment that is well worth doing right now, as all of the other strategies have failed, and doubling down on them would be a big mistake.
Yeah, I changed my mind after recording on this as it was starting to happen last week with you guys. I think initially I was thinking of it much more like who's going to replace McCarthy. Is the person who replaces McCarthy any better? Most of the floated possibilities were not. So I was kind of like, what is this really going to do? And I think that was really the wrong way of looking at it, because you can change the leadership dynamic in the Republican Party one of two ways. The most obvious one is the one I was thinking of, which is swapping out its leaders. And in some cases that might be necessary, but there is another way you can change that dynamic, and that's by cutting their power to lead and changing sort of who, in this case in the House, has the ability and more leverage over what the agenda of Republicans in Congress actually ends up being. And so for that reason, I think this was a very successful rebellion. I always like to see a pound of flesh extracted from leadership. They deserve it. But also, some of these substantive changes going forward really does empower. And frankly, I think it actually behooves us to hold our members collectively much more accountable, because now they can't hide behind a lot of these measures. And that's why I do think these changes are so substantive. this is going to force a lot more votes as far as I understand it. And so we're going to actually be able to see where some of these folks actually stand, as opposed to hiding behind, well, this has to pass, it's 1.7 trillion, or the government shuts down. Yeah, it has some bad stuff in it, but there's some necessary stuff in it too. So what did you want me to do? Vote against it? I think that accountability might end up being much more important in the long run.
So I have to say, I was hoping that we would have over 133 ballots and break the record. So I was sad to see it end at 15. But that said, what was achieved through those 15, I think, was seminal for conservatives. This was a perfect representation of conservatives actually wielding outsized power relative to their numbers. This was a silver lining of the small majority in the House. Let's not forget, if there had been a larger majority, these concessions would have never been granted. And I think one of the things that was quite revealing about this episode, Josh touched on the media a bit, is just how uniform the media was, for the most part, right and left, in the narrative that these were terrorists who were holding up the process and holding the country hostage and the like. And it just struck me as someone who's at a remove from Washington, D.C., I think, thankfully, in a case like this, so disingenuous, but maybe from the perspective of those acting hysterically about this, actually genuine. The utter gall that these 20 conservatives would have to actually negotiate over basic things like taking time to read bills, or the fact that all the power shouldn't be concentrated in the Speaker of the House, or that maybe conservatives should get bigger representation on significant committees within that House. I know there's some conservatives who have raised objections in terms of some of in the rules package, which is quite vital, regarding oversight powers. Like, for example, I believe the Speaker can still ultimately shoot down subpoena requests individually, which has hampered conservative efforts in the past, and I think that still remains. But nevertheless, had there not been this effort by these purported, quote unquote holdouts, we would have never achieved these gains. And I think these gains are beneficial to the American people. They're beneficial to have regular order and actual deliberation in the House. And that's a huge victory that should be cherished in a very difficult time.
So the final thing that I'll say, and then let's toss it over to Inez for our next segment here. The other interesting dynamic that I think happened here was, this was one of the first kind of intra-Republican, intra-conservative fights that we've had that was not about Trump. So, during the Trump era, it was kind of like Trump versus never Trump. This was kind of almost like a pre-2016 style fight of like conservatives versus the establishment. It's kind of like a binary. It's a paradigm. It's a dynamic that just totally disappeared. Very interesting that we saw a return to that. Maybe we'll come back to that in final thoughts. But for now, let's toss it over to Inez for our next segment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Josh, by the way. So for my segment, I want to focus on something that was released last week, a piece of reporting by Nate Hochman over at National Review that I think got a ton of attention, rightly so, but deserves, I think, more analysis. So it's a really great look at into the lobbying dynamics within the South Dakota legislature and how socially conservative bills get killed by Republicans in a deep red state. And I think this story has so much resonance outside of the state of South Dakota, because it really is a story of how big business still has so much purchase over Republicans and can effectively basically short circuit a very popular socially conservative agenda in states where the actual specifics of that agenda are not in controversy at all. They're overwhelmingly popular. So Nate basically lays out how Kristi Noem's office and as well as the legislature itself are bowing to a entity called Sanford Health. It is a very large employer. This is a health company that is a very large employer in South Dakota, and has basically behind the scenes killed all kinds of legislation, starting with a ban on males in women's sports that ultimately went back to the governor to sign after she vetoed it. But all kinds of socially conservative legislation. So, for example, conscience rights for medical practitioners who objected to performing abortion and gender transition, a law banning puberty blockers and sex reassignment surgery for children under 16, a whole bunch of other bills, which, by the way, directly conflict with Sanford's business interests. They're making quite a lot of money performing these procedures, right? So it's not that this company or that Governor Noem, for example, never went against this company. She cited a few instances where she did, but overwhelmingly, both in the legislature and the governor's office, it is really, really difficult for a small state like South Dakota to actually buck this kind of corporate power and threat of woke capital. This is a dynamic that cannot continue in the Republican Party if we're to get anywhere. Again, so actually, I really can't stand Kristi Noem for all kinds of reasons, this primary among them, but I do want to give her at least this much I guess, a bit of a reprieve on this. I think it's very difficult for a small state to really seriously buck business interests. And when those business interests are not just lobbying for, sort of goodies on the tax code, but they're directly lobbying and threatening essentially capital strikes against small states on the basis of social issues, it really, really behooves red states to actually bind together on issues like this and provide some kind of collective power behind those kinds of pushbacks, because it is frankly easier for a state like Florida to push back against Disney than it is for a state like South Dakota, because Florida is very big. It has a very big economy. It's very, sort of business friendly climate. Lots of businesses want to be in Florida. If you're a small state and you have a smaller economy, you're much more dependent. But at the end of the day, this is the kind of dynamic that just cannot continue in the Republican Party. I highly recommend this reporting, because this is happening in red state legislatures all around the country on a whole host of social issues. This is a large reason why I think voters feel so incredibly frustrated when there's something that's popular, not just with the right, by the way, but with independents and even some Democrats. Issues like surgically mutilating minors who have a delusion about being the opposite sex. These are 75, 80% issues, maybe even 85% issues for the right. And the reason that it's so difficult to enact them, even in red legislatures, is dynamics like this behind the scenes. And every state has a Sanford, right? Every state has a cabal of essentially woke capital businesses that are now heavily using that leverage. And as much as I like what Ron DeSantis has been doing to push back on this, I do think it's probably necessary for all red states to sort of, one, expose this dynamic, and two, use some kind of collective power to push back on this, because small red states are probably going to get run over effectively by this dynamic. So with that, I'll throw it out to the rest of the crew.
So Nate did a fantastic job with this article. It was a really well-researched, well-reported article. One thing that Nate Hochman also does, which is really good, if for those of you who are less familiar with his work, he does these prolific tweet threads when he writes an article that are just extremely easy and good to follow. It kind of just makes your job a lot easier as a news consumer. I probably should do the same thing, to be honest with you, although I'm not a reporter, but I guess it's neither here nor there. Anyway, to get back to the substance of what was going on here, I think Inez analyzes very well. I mean, a lot of these smaller states are, by definition, going to be disproportionately more prone to venality, to lobbying, to special interests of this nature. It's counterintuitive in a sense, because South Dakota, based on the polling, Nate cited this poll in his tweet thread, I think, where he was like, it was a Pew or Gallup poll, whatever, it was like asking the citizens of each state to identify as conservative, moderate, liberal. I think South Dakota was like literally the second or third most conservative state. So it's a bit of a paradox, but because it's such a small and rural and sparse state, if you have one private organization like Sanford that is able to accumulate this much power, it could be disproportionately influential. That is not to exculpate, by the way, Kristi Noem or South Dakota Republicans who have consistently dropped the ball on a number of these issues. I think Kristi Noem has effectively done a mea culpa on the transgender sports issue, but she only did so after conservative media basically tore her a new rear end, I guess would be the polite way of saying it. So she has shown herself capable of kind of licking her finger and kind of putting it out there to see which way conservative media is blowing. Another aspect of the story that I thought was interesting, I guess you would say, is that Kristi Noem's combative spokesperson, a gentleman by the name of Ian Fury, just unloaded on Nate Hochman when Nate asked for a formal comment about the article that he was writing. And he unloaded on Governor DeSantis, even though Governor DeSantis had nothing whatsoever to do with this article. And Ian Fury unloaded on him on an unrelated issue, talking about the abortion issue and the Dobbs Supreme Court case. And it was really just utterly bizarre. This is now public. Now numerous articles have been written about it. But I remember like when Nate first texted me about this, I couldn't even believe my own eyes. I mean, like very, very, very weird. So I say that only to note that it seems like the 2024 sweepstakes stuff is already starting. I would speculate based on that exchange from Ian Fury that Kristi Noem was trying to position herself as President Trump's vice presidential running mate would be my best guess, but it was a very bizarre episode, and I thought it was worth flagging.
She also did a similar thing at CPAC last year, where she intentionally mentioned like closing beaches in a way that seemed to be a pretty veiled stab at DeSantis. And Ian did something similar when the trans story first broke, and just unloaded on conservative media, directly unloaded on conservative media, which had really gone to bat for Noem at a time when the mainstream media was attacking her. The so-called mainstream media was attacking her. So I think that's going to be an ongoing problem for Noem. But that's why, to Inez's point, which is really, really important, we hear about this after the norms have sort of already been changed, after the Sanford Health people have already gotten into the government, after they have weighed in on numerous bills that favor Sanford over maybe what's right for the state. We don't know that. Obviously, I'm sure in a lot of cases there are good arguments in favor of business and whatever it is. But we hear about this afterwards, and that means that there was probably an opportunity for whatever politician or their staff or political staff in any given state to draw a red line before this became a public problem, to gather everyone and say, listen, no, before it even becomes a public tug of war, to say the red line here is like you trying to import Brooklyn ideology to South Dakota or Indiana or North Carolina, as has happened over the last several years. And it doesn't mean that their jobs are easy, because this is getting to them after Hollywood and the media have used their incredible might to change these norms and to create those pressures to begin with. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It is very hard, because business people will come to you with these arguments about jobs and incomes and people's livelihoods, but obviously there have to be spines of steel. And I hope the fact that Noem has sort of shifted on this issue, that Nate at National Review is getting the bandwidth to do a lot of dogged reporting on this, and others are as well. I hope that means that children are going to increasingly be protected from this ideology. But Inez, I think I would just double down on everything you said, because I think it was important and really well said.
A few just quick observations. One, a question, but sort of a rhetorical one, is what is the conservative parallel to this? Like, I can't think of any business or parallel cause that conservatives have taken up, and then they're able to kind of corrode the establishment within a given state and take it over, particularly a state that's antithetical. It would be like pro-Second Amendment groups via a company somehow completely shifting the laws on guns within a place like New York or Massachusetts or California. It'd be unthinkable, essentially. Now, to be fair, South Dakota, as we've discussed, does have some unique conditions that make it, it's hard to think of a parallel of sort of a single company town, so to speak, where this dynamic could play out. But the broader dynamic of having these corporations that lead essentially Hydra-headed movements with front activist groups that they're backing in order to launder positions and take over from within, that is perfectly on brand for how the progressive left dominates across a whole slew of issues. And I think it's worth noting they are doing this on basically every single progressive agenda item in every single state all the time, perpetually. And it feels as if we're constantly on the defensive. At some point, we have to get to the offensive. And sometimes, we're about to enter the NFL playoffs, so that's where my mind is right now. Sometimes the best defense is a great offense. And we need to think much more creatively, I think, about how we don't necessarily mimic the way that the left operates, because we're probably not going to beat them at their own game, but we ought to think of ways to aggressively use power where we have it as well. And that goes beyond political power, even though we should wield it, of course, where we can. On that note, I guess we can transition back to myself here, no pun intended, on the transition point. And maybe I'll return to final thoughts on that to just ask the question, why is it that elites are so fixated on the trans issue itself? Maybe we can get into that in a bit. But I'll talk about perhaps a more optimistic subject, I guess, which is the subject that I always return to on this show, the hyper politicization and weaponization of the national security and law enforcement apparatus. And thankfully, one of the so-called concessions that Kevin McCarthy agreed to for the speakership was to launch a church-style, at least it's been claimed to be a church-style subcommittee under the House Judiciary Committee, chaired by the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan, on the weaponization of the federal government. And if you look at the founding resolution for this subcommittee, it basically gives that subcommittee carte blanche to pursue civil rights violations writ large, both in terms of unlawful and unethical behavior across the full scope of the executive branch. It doesn't specifically say just FBI, just DOJ, but actually executive agencies, their collusion with entities outside the government, and across the full array of civil liberties violations that they've engaged in. So theoretically, this could encompass about anything under the sun. It's also worth noting in the resolution that it calls for the ability to provide oversight over pending criminal investigations as well. So that points to activities that are going on right this instant. So obviously, I'm a huge proponent of a church-style committee. I've written about it at length in the past. And there's great promise and a great opportunity here to be seized if the committee can seize it. So I would just raise, I guess, a few things, and I'm writing a long form piece on this. It'll probably be out maybe next week, maybe end of this week, around when this episode comes out. But there are some critical questions that have to be thought through in connection with this exercise. First of all, it has myriad constraints that it is facing, and the enemies of this committee will try to exploit them to the fullest extent, namely including the fact that there's finite time, finite resources, that this is, of course, concerning secretive and sensitive areas of the federal government. So there's going to be stonewalling, subterfuge, game playing with redactions, and the like. And if this committee actually does what it promises to do, it's going to find itself up against the entirety of the deep state, the Democrat Party, much of the Republican Party, and the corporate media, just for starters. So there's a whole slew of headwinds facing this committee to the extent it takes on the behemoth, the tip of the spear of ruling class power in the national security and law enforcement apparatus. And given those constraints, I think a few things that need to be really thought out are, one, prioritization of issues, and how are you going to pursue those issues given the constraints that I just mentioned? And that's going to require real forethought and planning about who will staff this committee, and not just in terms of the members, but also the advisors, the lawyers, the consultants, et cetera, who are going to be helping pursue these investigations. Another aspect with respect to beyond personnel is not only how you prioritize issues, but what issues are actually going to resonate, and how do you expose them to the American people, given the inherent secrecy that's involved. Thomas Massie, when he was talking about potentially becoming a member of this committee, noted that much of the work is going to be done in a skiff, that is, in secret. What this committee unearths has to be open to the public, and that the intelligence community is going to be leaking all sorts of unfavorable things to the media, and not just the IC, but of course the Democrat members as well, to try to undermine the committee. So it's really imperative up front that it defines success, that it prioritizes the issue that it's going to pursue, and that it's very careful about the personnel that are selected. And what would success look like? To my mind, it would be a handful of things. One, expose the full size, scope, and nature of the most egregious of civil rights violations that these agencies have engaged in. Two, provide a form of justice, in a sense, in a forum for those who have been victimized by the national security apparatus to publicly testify, because if they're not going to get justice, at least they can get some catharsis in that, and the American people can understand the wages of a corrupted deep state. Then beyond that, fully exposing, of course, not only the wrongdoing, but holding the feet to the fire of these agencies to actually punish those who engaged in malfeasance, and of course, proposing laws and ultimately gaining public support for laws that will radically restructure our national security apparatus so that it cannot act tyrannically in targeting more than half the country. So with that, that's kind of my broad 30,000-foot overview. I'm curious as to your thoughts as to kind of the promises and perils associated with this committee.
Well, it's very good, obviously, that one of the numerous concessions that were extracted from Chip Roy and his allies was this promise to go down this road. It's something that has been a recurring theme of this podcast for probably since the day we launched this podcast now. Certainly Ben has been on top of the Russia collusion delusion, as Roger Kimball calls it. You've been on top of this more than probably anyone in the right of center punditry space, maybe other than Lee Smith himself. So it's very good that we're going down this road here. The thing that I think that we have to understand, I think back actually to Darren Beattie's speech at NatCon 3 back in Miami in September. And he was talking about kind of, being a nationalist at a time when the intelligence communities are so arrayed against the interests of American nationalism, of American nationalists, of American patriots, frankly, there. And it's an unsustainable tension. And it's very important that conservatives, who traditionally speaking have been the party of the intelligence community, have been the party of the federal law enforcement apparatus. I mean, Sean Hannity to this day wears the CIA lapel pin on his Fox News program every night. So it's important that House Republicans are taking this affirmative step of recognizing, because, back in the day, obviously, even as recently to a large extent as kind of the Edward Snowden saga going back in 2013, even at that time, and I'll be very honest with you, I have mixed thoughts, I would say, on Snowden to this day, although my stance on Snowden has frankly moderated a lot over the years. I was very hardline against him when it first came out. Now I'm a little more torn now that I've seen how so many of these programs have been used. But at the time in 2013, I think most of kind of the leading, proponents of IC reform, transparency, privacy were coming from the political left. So the fact that it's now coming from the political right is just a huge paradigm shift, frankly. And given what we have seen on just an empirical level from the CIA and the FBI, I think it is long overdue, and it makes me quite happy. Do the ladies have any word on this?
I was going to say I'm in a standoff with Inez, but I couldn't get my mute. I couldn't unmute fast enough. No, I'll just quickly add. I mean, I think if this is done right, we talked on my colleague Ryan Grimm, my co-host Ryan Grimm, and I today interviewed Ro Khanna, and Ryan pressed Ro Khanna on whether he would join the committee, and Ro Khanna said, probably not, because I would want to have assurances that it's not going to be, I think he said something about like a Hunter Biden, like political grandstanding type thing. And you know what? I actually think that's advice well worth taking from Republicans, just because this is such an important issue. This is such a huge topic. This is not, we're not investigating one single incident. We're investigating this massive, powerful apparatus of the government that has, in a bipartisan basis, to the point where you have reporters like Matt Taibbi, people from Matt Taibbi to Lee Smith, diving into this and really trying to understand the full scope of what's happened. I actually think, doing something sober and serious. The media is never going to give a Republican committee the benefit of the doubt, but to model off of the church committee, I love that language has been used by Ben and others, even Kevin McCarthy himself, because a serious, sober, substantive dive into this that can bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats. If you can pull that off, I know it's not easy, and that's asking a lot, but if there's a way to do it, if there's a pathway to have a real church committee in 2023, it is deeply, deeply needed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Emily more. This problem is systemic. By the way, I think Ilhan Omar is citing that this is a positive consequence of the rule change. So there's some horseshoe effect happening here. But yeah, I mean, this is a systemic problem. The problem is biggest in those agencies that have direct power to spy on and otherwise screw with the lives of the American people, and that's in our intelligence communities and law enforcement communities. But it is broader than that, right? This is not an exclusive problem to our intelligence communities. It's just hit finally even these, and I think that the reason for the reversal is just so obvious. I mean, the way that Josh talked about it, right? The way that conservatives thought about the FBI and CIA 10, 20 years ago. I mean, the reason's obvious, right? That this revolution has hit all of the institutions and weaponized them for the left. It's a pure self-interest reversal, but there's nothing sort of wrong with that on our end. These agencies are coming after American citizens, and we should take that extremely seriously for all the reasons that Ben has laid out week after week after week on this podcast, which is that a double standard in justice really just very quickly destroys political community. One final thing, of course, I think it was Adam Schiff who is now saying that Republicans want to defund the police, which is just a particularly juicy, hilarious bit of cope on his part. So I enjoyed that. But yes, I wholly agree. I guess I'm 100% on board with what Emily said. The best way to do this would actually be to take it very seriously. Now, if that means investigating Hunter Biden, that might be part of what's going on, but we should always keep our eye on the larger picture and not just on this one instance, or even just the instance of the raid at Mar-a-Lago or any of these other instances. We should point out that this is systematic, and that's why it's so dangerous.
Yeah, and the media love shiny objects, and they would love to focus on all of the distractions more than anything else. But I do think there's a real risk. One thing we saw in the speakership battle, although it was kind of reined in, is the goofball caucus being useful idiots for the media to beat the drum. If you're using these as PR stunts, something like a new church committee or the motion to vacate, if you're using that as an opportunity for public relations, it's going to undermine everything. And so there's some of this has to be done very carefully. But I'll go here to Joe Biden's border trip this week. I'm calling it a border trip, but he actually really spent more time in Mexico. He met with AMLO. He went to El Paso, and it was pretty much went exactly as you would expect it to go. It's worth noting that there were record numbers of crossings in October, November, and December. I believe from what we know, about 2.76 million crossings over the course of 2022, an astounding number that blows records out of the water. It's an emergency. If it were under a Republican president, or if it were happening on this scope in a cause that Democrats actually care about, this would be wall to wall every single day, headlines constantly, because what you're seeing in El Paso is human carnage in the streets, people sleeping in the streets. It was all cleaned up for Joe Biden's visit, just like Union Station here in DC was when he gave a nice little speech there late last year. But they cleaned up El Paso. He didn't speak to a migrant in El Paso. He went to a respite center, and sources told the media, well, it just so happened. It was just an honest to goodness coincidence. There were no migrants there that day. They just hadn't come in. Just a remarkable excuse to not talk to migrants in El Paso. Unbelievable. But he also the trip coincided with a rollout of announcements and changes in his border policy. So for instance, he is going to be ramping up expulsions of people who crossed illegally from certain countries, and then also creating pathways, though, for people from some of those same countries to make asylum claims. And it's really not a revamping of our asylum policy. I think some of it is genuinely helpful. I think some of it is actually going in the right direction. But you can do this until you're blue in the face. And if you don't actually overhaul the asylum system, we will still continue to see high levels of despair, humanitarian crises at the border and in these various border cities on a daily basis. To some extent, the United States is never going to be able to completely eliminate that, because we're a place that people will literally die to get into. And so that's never something you can completely eliminate, but we can do a much better job of mitigating it. And one of those ways is by obviously overhauling our asylum system and making asylum available to people who desperately really need it. I mean, some of the people that are getting hurt by our broken asylum system right now are people who should have easy, legitimate claims to asylum, people from Venezuela and Cuba who have crossed illegally and may now be sent back under Title 42 or other measures. They should easily be able to claim asylum. That is a point of pride for the American people, is how they have treated Cuban refugees over the years. But right now, because of the knotted up system, you have so many false asylum claims. That's what draws people up here. And the last thing I'll mention before tossing it open to the group is Todd Benjamin, one of the best beat reporters on the immigration beat, had a great report this week about how the UN, which is funded by us, is actually funding debit cards and vouchers in southern Mexico for people to come up through Central America, go north, and wait in our border cities like Reynosa. So as we put more money into Border Patrol, we are undermining the money by giving it to the UN for these types of purposes. And it's just an outrageous cycle of disaster. So with that, I toss it open to the group.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously one of the worst instances of, or worst indications of the deep dysfunction of this country that is just papered over by wealth and the illusion of a kind of quasi normalcy. Um, we have to have this final hour decision from the Supreme Court, and then this like bill that's rammed through to keep any lid on our open border problem, even to the extent that Democratic mayors were complaining about it, right? And declaring it an emergency. And just today, the FAA has to ground all flights like it's 9/11, right? Because they're screwing it up so bad, right? Wells Fargo, the bank, is resurrecting redlining, this time for white neighborhoods. That's maybe something to touch on in the in the final thoughts. But I just see all of this like very deep crazy things that are happening that are just papered over by essentially, I think, primarily people who just do not want to see how deep the division and the dysfunction is in this country. And I'll close with a final thought, which is, if it's fascist to want to have a border, eventually, right? Eventually, if you call everybody who wants to have a border fascist, eventually fascists will be the only people who want to protect the border, and that will sound normal to most people. So I really think that this is, in itself is such an important issue in terms of, you can't be a country without a border. You can't have this sort of gaping hole on the southern part of the border where there's no security, no rule of law, and endlessly dump that problem on initially on the people who live there, and then eventually on the entire country. Which, by the way, this horrible omnibus package that was shoved through, one of the many things in there is additional financial help for a bunch of liberal sanctuary cities to deal with the influx of migrants from our borders. So yeah, I even though as important as the issue is itself, I see it as even worse, a deep sign of decline and dysfunction that we just pretend is business as usual.
So I'm happy that Emily gave a shout out to Todd Benjamin, who was really one of the unsung heroes of conservative investigative journalism over the past probably 15, 20 years, honestly. Todd lives in Texas. I want to say that he was actually kind of like the guy who broke the Holy Land Foundation trial back in like 2007, which was kind of the largest domestic terror financing case in United States history. So Todd is a huge unsung hero. I think it was Daniel Horowitz who first kind of opened my eyes to him a number of years ago. He does fantastic work, and he's been all over the immigration, the cartels, trafficking for years now. So, would strongly encourage the listeners and viewers of this show to go ahead and check out Todd's work. One headline I should say that stood out to me this week was that Jared Polis in Colorado has apparently announced his intention to bus migrants, to Washington, D.C., New York City. Very, very interesting. I mean, when you say, and Jared Polis, just to kind of clarify here, is a very prominent elected Democrat of what is increasingly a bright blue state, the state of Colorado. So very interesting now that you're not just seeing folks like Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis who are getting into kind of the busing migrants game, but there is a prominent big blue state where a governor who potentially has 2024 or 2028 presidential ambitions, but nonetheless, he is choosing to kind of do the same thing. He has spoken quite openly about, the crisis at the southern border. So that to me was a very, very important headline. On the merits of the border issue itself, I mean, I don't really know what to say, honestly, that has not been said time and time again. It's just such a tragedy. And the fact that the wealthiest country in the history of the world cannot secure its own border with a failing narco state, which is what Mexico is in its current form to our south, the country that put a man on the moon, that invented the internet. I mean, whatever you want to say, that we can't just build this freaking wall it has nothing to do whatsoever with technology or funding or the finances. It is a pure lack of willpower. As the saying goes, decline is a choice. And in this case, a wide, gaping open border is a choice that our political elites are making. Unfortunately, we, the people, are the ones who bear the repercussions of that choice.
Well, and since you mentioned the wall, worth noting that at the Three Amigos summit, there's a quote from Mexico's President Lopez Obrador, where he says, Joe Biden is the first president in a very long time that has not built even 1 meter of wall. We thank you for that. We're number one. What a remarkable quote that is coming from Obrador. And, my kind of snarky take on this is borders are bigoted. So why is Joe Biden going down there and promoting bigotry? I would love actually him to be questioned just on that sort of cognitive dissonance that exists on their side. But I also think there is a political question of why does he feel a need to actually even go on a Potemkin visit down there? Is it that devastating a position ultimately they think politically going into 2024? Is this just a rubber stamping exercise that they felt has to be done? Is it because of the likes of a Jared Polis? If you've lost Jared Polis, then maybe you do have a serious problem among Democrats. And obviously there's been outspoken criticism from the likes of Eric Adams and I think Muriel Bowser as well in DC and in other blue enclaves as well, because they're having to deal with the consequences of the very problems that they all support, endorse, and promote. So, to that end, it strikes me as very interesting, the timing of this, the why. And maybe I'll talk about this in our parting shots in just a second, but similarly, the timing of the drop of the Biden papers on the first working business day after a Republican speaker has been selected. I think there could be some interesting tea leaves to be read through on that as well.
Well, on that note, let's go ahead and transition to final thoughts. Who wants to start us off?
So I guess I'll go first. I mean, I said at the beginning that I would return to my trip, and I guess I might as well do that. So there are two quick things from a political perspective that I guess I'll flag that I kind of had discussions on over the course of this trip. One thing that so Israel has a new government. Netanyahu is back in power. I guess it was actually while I was there, the Knesset, their parliament, formally ratified this new coalition. And one of the allegedly controversial, but really not particularly controversial things that the new government is trying to do is pass this judicial reform package that would effectively tame the power of the Israeli Supreme Court, which all the usual critics, Human Rights Watch, and all those folks are saying is like an assault on democracy. Is Israel going the way of authoritarian Hungary? I mean, the listeners of this podcast know how these headlines go at this point. The Israeli Supreme Court, it's worth bearing in mind, is one of, if not the single most radically out of control courts in the entire Western world. So what happened in the 1990s, there was a justice who basically arrogated unprecedented power. They have the ability to strike down whatever they want for any reason at any time whatsoever, for policy reasons. The Israeli Supreme Court is even able to veto the government's picks for cabinet positions, for minister of justice, for minister of whatever, for literally no other reason other than they feel like it. So it's a wild situation over there. And the fact that they're taking some basic powers to tame it in is a good thing. Newsweek published a good op-ed on this from a law professor by the name of Avi Bell. So I would encourage you guys to go ahead and check that out. One other tidbit. So I mentioned I went to the UAE as well there. I was personally blown away by what I saw in the UAE. I'm not sure if any of the three of you guys have been to Dubai or Abu Dhabi. It's really cool. And not just Dubai, which is, properly, gets a lot of the attention. It's ridiculously flashy and all the money, and the Burj Khalifa, where I saw New Year's Eve, the fireworks, it's all crazy. But like Abu Dhabi itself, the capital, the Grand Mosque, the Imperial Palace there, it's just stunning. I mean, honestly, the palace in Abu Dhabi, I think back to maybe Versailles in France, which I was at 13 years ago. I mean, it's hard to compare, obviously, very different style, but a similar sense of kind of just overwhelming. The geopolitical thing about my trip to the UAE that I will highlight is I spent a solid hour and a half, 2 hours with a very plugged in local Emirati guy whose name I will, respect and not name him there. But we're kind of talking about the Abraham Accords, because the UAE has very much emerged as the face of the Abraham Accords. They have really promoted kind of this Israeli-Arab reconciliation, probably more so than any of the other signees to the Accords. We're talking about whether it will expand. The $1 million question, of course, is will Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman end up joining the Accords there? And what I heard over and over again from my friends there, who again I will leave nameless, is that it's just highly unlikely to happen under President Joe Biden, for the very simple reason that he continues to flirt with Iran, which is the country that these Arab countries are all terrified of. And there's this kind of, I think, understanding that the Abraham Accords peace deals will probably not expand beyond their current form unless the United States stops flirting with the Iranian regime, trying to get this JCPOA package back together and all of that. So that was sobering, but also worth bearing in mind, I think, from a domestic perspective as well.
Well, let me just say, Josh, you may leave that individual nameless, but I guarantee you our intelligence community knows full well who you're meeting with. So, and on that note, I did want to read a couple of endorsements, the two best endorsements that I've seen thus far of the Weaponization Committee. The ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler, said, and I quote, "The GOP is launching a new version of the Un-American Activities Committee designed to inject extremist politics into our justice system and shield the MAGA movement from the legal consequences of their actions. It undermines our democracy and it threatens our safety and security." And then Jim McGovern of Massachusetts said on investigating this weaponization that it's, quote, "about attacking law enforcement. It's about going after people, destroying people's careers and lives, undermining the DOJ and defunding the police. The MAGA extremist fringe will use it to push QAnon." I don't think you could get more strong ringing endorsements than those words from Jerry Nadler and McGovern. And I will say, if this committee does what it claims to want to achieve, then every member will be smeared and maligned to an infinitely worse degree, probably, than a Devin Nunes was when he chaired the House Intelligence Committee. And they'll probably face a lot worse than the surveillance that we now know existed of Kash Patel, who was one of Devin Nunes's chief investigators, who we've just found out was being spied on by the DOJ/FBI during the very time when he was looking into the DOJ and FBI's malfeasance with respect to Russiagate/Spygate. These members and the other staffers on this committee, I expect to be under total assault, and it's already happened since before the committee has even convened. So let's hope that it follows through and the attacks grow infinitely more unhinged, but they need to be steel-spined in the face of the onslaught against them. I think I'll cabin my remarks on the Biden papers till next week. Maybe there'll be further revelations about them. Have a few theories on that, but I'll leave that as a teaser for next week.
Yeah, my favorite revelation about that whole episode so far is that Biden was getting paid $1 million basically to not teach any classes. And so that's just another nice little window into the cushy lives of ex-politicians when they leave office. But I also kind of earmarked this Wells Fargo announcement saying they're going to be pulling back out of the mortgage market, except for their pre-existing customers and minority majority neighborhoods, right? So this looks very much like reverse redlining. Of course, nobody called it that except some folks on Twitter, but definitely something worth keeping an eye on. There will probably be a lawsuit over that based on the precedents set in the 70s, 80s, and 90s about redlining. And the other thing I want to note, which is, I think, something that we're going to unfortunately be seeing and previewing this for the coming months and years, there appears to be a major change in the drug and opiate crisis in America. There is a new drug. It's apparently a veterinary sedative of some kind. I'm going to try to pronounce it, but the name is hard to pronounce. Xylazine. It is actually fentanyl is being cut with xylazine. So we no longer have heroin and other drugs being cut with fentanyl. We have fentanyl being cut with xylazine, and it has some really, really horrible consequences, as you can imagine. It also can't be reversed with Narcan, which is that anti-opiate that has been legitimately saving a lot of people's lives in America when they overdose on opiates. Apparently, it is already in 31 states and in Washington, D.C., and it's only increasing. This is coming from Dr. Ben Braddock on Twitter, at Graduated Ben, for those of you who want to follow him. But I think it's probably a really grim preview of what we might see in the future. This is not a scheduled drug, by the way. So this is, you can have this shipped from veterinary supply companies, and dealers are using it to cut fentanyl because apparently in combination with fentanyl, it gives a more original heroin-like high. But yeah, unfortunately, this is going to be showing up in our hospitals and in cities like San Francisco on the streets. So a grim preview.
Well, on that note, the way that I started my story on what happened with Kevin McCarthy in the speakership battle last week is by running down kind of a laundry list, a really depressing laundry list of negative metrics that show America in decline, that show the sort of state of emergency. And I think one of those metrics has to be not just suicide rates, especially among teenagers, overdoses, addiction struggles, mental health struggles. The metrics across the board on those measures are terrible. And it gets to exactly why, like the political establishment is shocked that populists on the right are pushed by their constituents and are representing, to borrow a phrase from the name of their body, those constituents that feel like their communities are in a state of emergency, that feel like their country is declined. That should surprise absolutely nobody in the political establishment. And yet they're eager to sort of to frame the populists as extremists, as people who are radical and demanding too much of their government, when they demand things like attention being paid to the border. Because do I think a wall is going to stop the influx of fentanyl? Do I think it's going to stop the pre-chemicals coming over from China and then being mixed up by cartels in these labs? No. But of course, forcing a conversation about how border security outside of a wall, for instance, the wall is important because it sort of nudges people into particular ports of entry as opposed to crossing anywhere they want. And it's easier for us to deal with the situation in that sense. But that's why, because these things have gotten so bad in ways that Inez just laid bare and described in a painful and frightening way, because we will lose kids to this. We will lose people to this. And people will lose if their lives don't end because of this. They will lose chunks of their lives. They will lose marriages. The wreckage will be incredible. They're losing it every single day if we don't deal with this. And we just let the government continue on the omnibus schedule as usual and have no disruption to the dysfunction here in Washington, D.C., then again, decline is a choice. And so I think, it's only a good thing. This chaos and dysfunction, perhaps you could call it the lesser of two evils. It's only a good thing. You can't leave dysfunction with no dysfunction. There has to be a disruption of the status quo in Washington, D.C., because the status quo isn't working. So on that note, thanks so much for listening to another edition of NatCon Squad. On behalf of Ben, Inez, and Josh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.